There is a number that defines American muscle: 1969. The last year, Detroit was truly untouchable. The last year, the engineers still won. Before the lawyers, the insurance actuaries, and the emissions regulators ended the war before it was finished. And inside that single year, two cars emerged from the shadows that had no right to exist. Not because they were built in secret, though they very nearly were, but because they required two separate men at two separate companies to each decide independently that the rules written by their own corporations did not apply to them. One was a Chevrolet dealer from southwestern Pennsylvania who found a loophole inside his own corporation and drove a truck through it. The other was an entire division of Ford Motor Company that quietly disassembled its most ambitious engine and bolted it into a car it was never meant to fit. Both cars carry the same year on their VIN plates. Both were built to do one thing: win. And in 1969, they finally met on the drag strip. 427 cubic inches versus 429 cubic inches. Iron block against iron block, outlaw against outlaw. This is the Yenko Camaro, 427 versus the Boss 429 Mustang. This is what happens when the rule breakers build the fastest thing they can imagine, and then race each other. Don Yenko ran a Chevrolet dealership in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, a small town 20 miles south of Pittsburgh, far enough from Detroit that the corporate memo about engine displacement limits arrived as a problem to be solved rather than an order to be obeyed. By any external measure, Yenko was unremarkable. A regional dealer moving Chevrolets off a lot in western Pennsylvania. But Yenko had one quality that separated him from every other Chevrolet dealer in America. He paid close attention to paperwork. In the mid-1960s, General Motors had issued a corporate directive: no engine larger than 400 cubic inches in any vehicle weighing less than 3,000 pounds. It was a political calculation. GM's insurance liabilities were escalating. Federal regulators were circling the performance industry, and the executive committee in Detroit wanted to moderate the horsepower arms race before Washington stepped in and did it for them. The engineers hated it, the sales teams hated it, but the policy stood, except for one small opening in the system. It was called the Central Office Production Order, COPO. It was designed for fleet sales. Police departments needed specific configurations. Taxi operators needed special drivetrains. Large corporations bought Chevrolets in bulk and needed custom specs. The COPO system allowed any dealer to order vehicles outside the standard option list, built to custom specifications, approved through Chevrolet's central office rather than through the normal consumer product channels. Don Yenko read the fine print, and then he called Vincent Piggins. Piggins was Chevrolet's product promotion manager, the same man who had quietly shepherded the original Z28 Camaro through GM's bureaucracy while describing it as a Trans Am homologation special rather than the outright street weapon it actually was. He had spent a career learning how to move things through General Motors without stopping to ask for formal permission. When Yenko called, Piggins already knew exactly what the question was going to be. COPO 9561, that was the order code. Engine option, the L72427 cubic inch V8, rated at 425 horsepower, an engine that GM's corporate directive explicitly forbade in the Camaro. But because the order routed through the central office rather than through standard consumer production, it existed in a legal gray zone that nobody at GM headquarters had thought to close. Not yet. In 1969, Yenko ordered 201 Camaros built to COPO 9561 specification. They arrived at his Canonsburg dealership as ordinary Camaros, Hugger Orange, Fathom Green, Dusk Blue, and left as something else entirely: the Yenko SYC Camaro 427, sticker on the cowl, Yenko stripes on the hood, and under that hood, the largest engine Chevrolet was officially pretending it had never put inside a Camaro. Quarter-mile time from the factory, 13.8 seconds at 103 miles per hour. In 1969, when the average muscle car was running 14s. With drag radials and a strip tune, experienced drivers were breaking into the low 13s. These were not street cars wearing race car clothing. They were race cars wearing street car clothing. On the other side of the country's longest automotive rivalry, Ford Motor Company was running a different kind of operation, and one that was, if anything, even more extreme in its engineering ambition and institutional determination. Ford's engineers had developed the 385 series, 429 cubic inch engine for use in full-size Fords, and the Lincoln Thunderbird. It was a truck engine by original temperament, big, heavy, built for torque and long-mile durability rather than peak revs. But inside that 429 block, Ford's racing division saw a structural foundation that nobody else had recognized. Room for a completely different kind of combustion architecture. The racing team redesigned the heads from scratch. Hemi-style combustion chambers, larger valve diameters than any Ford production engine had carried before. A revised port geometry that Ford labeled semi-hemispherical in its technical documentation, close enough to Chrysler's patented Hemi to concern Ford's legal department, and radical enough in its airflow characteristics to alarm the engineers at every competing track team in American racing. The racing version of the 429, internally designated the Boss 429, produced 375 horsepower in street trim. Ford's press office described this figure as conservative, which in the language of 1969 factory PR meant it was significantly understated. Race-prepared versions were producing numbers that Ford's communications team was declining to confirm in print. The engine was the most technically advanced unit Ford had fielded since the 427 Camaro, and it was built primarily to homologate a NASCAR racing engine for the 1969 season. But NASCAR homologation required street production, and the Boss 429 had a problem. It was too wide to fit inside the Mustang's engine bay. Not too wide by a small margin, too wide by a meaningful engineering margin. The front shock towers, primary structural members of the Mustang's unibody architecture, sat directly in the path of the exhaust manifolds. To install the Boss 429, Ford would have to physically relocate the front suspension geometry of the most popular car they made, cut the strut towers, modify the front crossmember, rebuild the steering geometry from scratch. On a production vehicle, most corporations would have selected a different engine. Ford contracted the job to Kar Kraft, a specialty engineering firm in Brighton, Michigan, that had previously worked on Ford's GT40 racing program. Kar Kraft disassembled every Boss 429 Mustang by hand, off the main assembly line, relocated the shock towers outward, reworked the front suspension geometry, installed the engine with revised mounts, and sent each car back to Ford for final inspection. It was an industrial process that had never been attempted in American volume manufacturing, and it added $1,208 to the cost of every car, a figure Ford absorbed entirely because losing NASCAR homologation was the only alternative. 1,359 Boss 429 Mustangs were built in 1969, every one of them touched by Kar Kraft technicians in Brighton, every one of them carrying an engine that the Mustang's own chassis had originally declared physically impossible. Set these two engines side by side on a dyno sheet and the Yenko appears to hold the advantage. The L72427 runs a solid lifter camshaft, no hydraulic lifters absorbing RPM, no mechanical softness at the top of the power band. It is built to live above 4,500 RPM and keep pulling to 6,500. The red line is not a warning, it is an invitation. The Boss 429, by contrast, runs a hydraulic camshaft in street specification. Its 375 horsepower rating reflects a more conservative power curve, broader torque delivery, better street manners, but on paper, less aggression at the top of the rev range than the L72's solid lifter setup. The specification sheet, however, does not tell the full story of what Ford built. The semi-hemispherical combustion chambers in the Boss 429 create a fundamentally different combustion event than a conventional big block. The enlarged valve surface area and the revised port geometry move air through the engine above 5,500 revolutions per minute in a way that the conservative rated output does not capture. Engineers who tested the Boss 429 on chassis dynos in period tests described the top-end pull as disproportionate to the cam specs. The engine accelerated harder above its rated peak than comparable hydraulic cam motors had any right to. The semi-Hemi design was doing things at high RPM that Ford's dyno numbers, taken at conservative peak revs, were not showing. On the Yenko side, the solid lifter L72 required approximately 800 miles of break-in before the cam lobes fully seated and the engine reached its designed performance curve. Testers who drove early COPO Camaros straight off the transporter were not driving the same engine as the one that ran the verified 13.8s. This matters because most of the documented period test results were gathered on engines that were still technically not fully on cam. So what happened when these two factory outlaws met on a drag strip in 1969? Car and driver ran a stock Boss 429 Mustang to 13.56 seconds at 105.5 miles per hour in the quarter mile. Motor Trend tested the same car and recorded 13.9 seconds at 102 miles per hour, a wider variance than the same magazine typically recorded between runs, attributed by track observers to the Boss 429's sensitivity to clutch slip at launch. The narrow low-end torque curve on the semi-Hemi meant that a driver who missed the launch by a fraction of a second paid for it in full at the timing lights. The Yenko Camaro, tested by the same publications, ran the quarter in 13.8 seconds at 103 miles per hour, with the explicit caveat that the L72's solid lifter cam had not yet completed break-in. In sorted trim, veteran strip operators were running the Yenko into the high 12 seconds on street tires with nothing more than a track alignment and a tire pressure adjustment. Strip to strip in fully sorted trim, the honest result was a dead heat. The Boss 429 held a measurable edge in high RPM top-end pull. Above 5,500 RPM, the combustion chamber geometry gave it something the L72 could not fully answer without forced induction. The Yenko held the edge in low-end torque delivery and in the weight advantage of its 3,100-pound curb weight against the heavier Mustang platform at 3,480 pounds. A 380-pound difference at the line is not nothing. It is the difference between a car that launches and a car that scrambles for traction. The verdict from the drag strips of 1969 was that these two cars were separated by tenths of a second across multiple runs, which at this level of performance is exactly what a dead heat looks like. Neither car consistently beat the other. The variables, driver experience, track prep, ambient temperature, clutch technique on the Boss 429's narrow torque window determined the outcome on any given afternoon. The story of both cars ends in the same place and the same year. In 1970, General Motors closed the COPO loophole. The corporate displacement limit was restructured in a way that removed the central office gray zone Don Yenko had exploited. The 454 was now available in the Camaro through standard option channels, but the days of a Canonsburg dealer quietly ordering 427-engine Camaros through the corporate back door were finished. Yenko's production stopped. The COPO 9561 Camaro existed for exactly one model year, 201 cars, and the number is precise because it had to be, because Yenko kept meticulous production records, and because decades later those records would determine which cars were authentic and which were not. Ford ended Boss 429 Mustang production after 1970 as well. The total two-year production run was 1,359 cars in 1969 and 499 cars in 1970, a combined 1,858 examples of the most labor-intensive production car Ford had built since the original GT40 road car. Kar Kraft closed the Brighton facility. The NASCAR program the engine had been built to support had moved on to different homologation requirements. The Boss 429 had served its purpose and been retired, quietly, without a press release. Today, what those two men's decisions are worth is settled at auction. A documented 1969 Yenko Camaro 427, original L72 engine, verifiable COPO documentation, matching VIN, routinely brings $200,000 to $350,000 at major American auctions. Boss 429 Mustangs in comparable documented condition sell for $150,000 to $250,000. Both figures have increased at every significant collector car auction since 2010, outpacing the broader muscle car market by a measurable margin. But the auction results are almost beside the point. What Don Yenko understood, and what Ford's engineering team understood when they handed those Mustangs to the Kar Kraft floor crew in Brighton, was that the rules of 1969 were temporary. The muscle car era was already in its final chapter. The insurance actuaries had already done the math. The federal emissions standards were already written. The performance engineers on both sides of the Ford-GM rivalry already knew the window was closing. They had 1 year. 1 year where the loopholes were still open, the lawyers had not yet found them, and the drag strip was still the honest measure of what a factory could build when it was not being watched. And they used every second of it. 201 cars, 1,359 cars, 2 companies, 2 different approaches to the same problem, and a drag strip in 1969 where the answer was close enough that nobody could say for certain who had won. That is the thing about factory outlaws. They never really lose, they just eventually run out of time. If you have been here before, if you know what COPO 9561 actually means, if you know what Kar Kraft did and why nobody at Ford wanted it in the press kit, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and most of them, the history books got wrong.